Did it start? There it is.
Recording has started.
And then, are you good with screen time on your own, or do you want me to let you know when you have 5 minutes left?
Should be fine.
Okay.
Because I got the time right here.
Great. Do you need anything from me then? Other than pictures? Great.
Is there a trash can?
What?
Trash can?
Trash can. There is not. It is all the way in the back. And maybe only on this side. Nope, there's one back there.
I heard after I left your talk, you gave me a shout out. I heard after I left your talk, you gave me a shout out.
Yes. Somebody was asking about like, where do you go from this? Where did it start? And I was like, all right, well, science library and school stuff, some site.
That's what everyone's doing. All the cool kids are doing. Literally nothing public. It's kind of crazy that they can actually get deals. I'm like, how did you find this deal?
All right, everyone. So we are going to go into our next talk here. It is on PurpleTeam 101. If you would, please help me welcome Chris Peacock.
Thank you. All right, good day. After lunch spot, so hopefully you're not too tired. And maybe if I can get my clicker to work. All right, there we go. Christopher Peacock, I go by Chris. I started out doing help desk, moved over to network administrator, then worked my way up through security operations. At the time, it really wasn't called purple teaming. My boss was like, hey, we have an upcoming pen test and you know some pen testers. Maybe you should ping them and see what they're doing. And then let's test those out before our pen testers come in. So at the time, it was stuff like running malicious PowerShell. We really didn't have EDRs back in the day. So people just PowerShell through an environment. People still can really PowerShell well through an environment. But I was cat and mousing myself with some of those PurpleTeam tools that I knew we would see. And I made my CISO look great. Their also got me a bonus. So I quickly learned, I was like, I like this PurpleTeam thing. It makes us look good and it gets me more money. So I was like, PurpleTeaming seems pretty cool. And that's how I started out with PurpleTeam. From there, I went to Raytheon, where I led the threat hunting team there from the detection engineering side as well. And actually, I have my replacement is right here in the front row. So bug him, not me. He taught me. So I'm just kidding. I'll answer any questions later. So anyways, I have some certifications. I'm a top contributor to LawBass. If you don't know what LawBass is, I highly recommend you look into it. It's how adversaries leverage existing Windows, Microsoft utilities that are built into Windows. They use those maliciously. So when you see an alert that says PowerShell.exe and your SOC analyst takes that, looks up the hash on virus total, and they say, hey, that's signed by Microsoft and the hash is good. And they close the case as a false positive. That's kind of what Wabash is like. I also do Sigma, and we'll touch on that a little bit later as well, but that's enough about myself. My clicker's not working again. There we go. So current threat landscape. Honestly, when I did this, we're talking mostly to like large Fortune 100 companies, but as I've grown, I realized that most of the time we just have blue team. We don't even have a red team, and oftentimes we might not have CTI. People are like, I have a CTI feed, Chris. I'm like, but is it actually giving you actionable intelligence that makes your SOC analyst better? And typically it's no, it's hash values and IP addresses from known breaches, not the breach that you're having now or that you're gonna have tomorrow. So with that, we have a bunch of silo teams. If we even have all these teams, this thing's really jumping around on me. Okay, there we go. So the biggest takeaway from this is that right now, most blue teams don't validate anything. I've been in an organization where we went in and we ran a DNS query for the WannaCry domain. It's a very well-known domain. It should raise an alert within the SOC that says, hey, you have WannaCry in your environment. And when we went in and we did that, we actually realized that there was no alert. We were like, ooh, that's not good. You know, you could have WannaCry in your environment and not even know it. And then we dug even deeper and we realized that, well, for this organization, they're not even actually logging their DNS. And I'm saying this is a Fortune 200 company. They didn't know that they were logging, that they weren't logging their DNS. We also had another one. We went into a financial company and we started executing actions. And we're like, all right, let's check the EDR. What's going on with the EDR? Like, are there alerts or anything like that? And we actually found out that the EDR hadn't been reporting for 2 weeks. So it's a very common thing that people aren't actually validating that their tools are reporting and what they're reporting on. So we need to answer questions like, can we actually detect our adversaries? So that's the key thing that we're trying to drive, right? Everyone, well, not everyone. I get a collection bias as I work with very large companies, but most people right now that I talk to, they're talking about how do I reduce my mean time to detection? How do I reduce my mean time to response? And the way you do that is you figure out what alerts can we work with or generate that are going to catch that adversary early in the attack lifecycle. We have to test to know that. And also, are there logging gaps? Oftentimes, we're not testing that as well. If we do have CTI team, often it's focused on these atomic indicators, and we really need to evolve to procedures and behaviors. Atomic indicators, typically, if you are worried about a company over here, what ransomware hash they had, that's not going to be applicable for your organization because it's going to be a new hash. So it's likely going to be new IP addresses as well. So we need to evolve from that. We need to move on beyond those. That should be an automated process. Also, if you're paying for an IRC feed, I highly recommend just looking at a MISP instance, because most of the time you just get those for free, and MISP compiles like 50 some into one MISP instance, and you can hook that up to your SIM. The other area is the red team. Typically, we don't actually typically have these. That's the saddest part of it. But if you do have a red team or if you do have a pen test, they're often not talking with your blue team. So they hide their tricks. They also might not replicate what adversaries do. Red Canary actually talked about this in their yearly report. There's a great talk by Katie Nichols as well, where they go in and they talk about what real adversaries are doing and what tests they're seeing. And they typically don't align. So that's something to be concerned about. So how do we shift our landscape into purple, if we're just doing blue team, if we're just responding to alerts, how do we move beyond that? Well, it comes down to two key principles. And those principles are the threat understanding and then the detection understanding of that threat. So with the threat understanding, we need to understand what our adversaries are doing. If we're just going out and just trying to detect something because we think it's cool to detect, we're going to miss what our adversaries are actually doing. The other thing worth mentioning here is don't get focused on other threats. So I've seen it before where, say, like an elementary school will actually focus on what North Korea is doing to South Korea. You don't need to worry about that if you're that elementary school. Focus on maybe all the other elementary schools that have gotten popped by ransomware. Study what that ransomware adversary is doing instead. And then we get that detection understanding. But that detection understanding comes from the threat understanding, which will drive our validations. Once again, we want to validate that we have detections, that we have our logging. If you don't have metrics around things, you can't manage it. It's just, you're just hypothesizing at that point that you will detect it. We want to confirm that instead. So with threat understanding, what are the adversaries doing? You know, a lot of times I hear people, they think that ransomware is something that a user clicks an email and then it just spreads through the environment. That's not actually the case. Oftentimes there's an initial access broker that gets in, and then they have to laterally move in a manual format through the environment to find data worth exfiltrating. Then they also have to get domain admin creds so that they can push the ransomware to all the workstations. And then once we get to an area where we understand what the adversary is doing, that's where we can start thinking about what the adversary could do on their next engagement. And we call that procedural variance. So if they're gathering credentials with Mimikatz and Mimikatz starts flagging on a lot of their engagements, well, maybe they might use like proc dump instead of Mimikatz. So we start thinking about the procedural variance that they could have in their operations. And then we want to test that. So do we actually test the coverage of the adversary? Once again, can we do that validation? When we talk about the detection understanding too, are the behaviors logged or not? This is a huge one. When you're doing purple teaming, we're validating this and we're going to log any sort of visibility gaps. Oftentimes when I go into organizations, one of the biggest things we check is name type creation. And why we do that is because a Cobalt Strike, the default for Cobalt Strike, will actually have certain name types it creates, but a lot of EDRs don't log that. One thing we will also want to consider is when we trigger alerts, I've often gone into operations and a SOC is like, hey, we caught that activity. And I'm like, cool, what level of alert was that? And they're like, well, it was an informational level alert or a low level alert. How many people here actually work low level alerts? If you look around the room right now, no one's raising their hand. It's because no one actually works those. So if you tell me we have an alert for that, it doesn't matter unless it gets in front of someone's eyeballs, as I like to say. Because until we get it in part of someone's face, it's not actionable for our SOC. So we have to make sure that those alerts are actually getting to the SOC to be worked. So that's something to consider as well. And then when we're thinking about this, what we can do is if we have a low-level alert from our emulation and we look for the past 30 days and it doesn't trip except for when we run our emulation, all we have to do is just raise that alert level. We have detection engineering already there. We don't have to do it. We just have to raise that alert level so someone works it. After that, we look at, can we develop alerts for actions that we've missed? And then we also want to do detections. We want to validate those as well. Usually that's in a repeated cycle of our purple team. And then another area that sometimes we also test is, and I don't recommend doing this at the beginning of purple teaming, but this bottom one here is the response correct? One time I actually saw there was Mimikatz on a domain controller the AV removed Mimikatz, so then they closed the case because they said that the incident was solved. No one actually stopped to think, okay, how did a credential dumping tool get all the way to my domain? Typically, that's going to be a long attack path. So sometimes we actually have to go in and we have to make sure that the response is correct as well. But I don't recommend doing that until you're more mature in the PurpleTeam cycle. So what does it look like when we're talking about doing a PurpleTeam cycle? We get that threat intelligence of what our adversary is doing. Then we replicate the attack. And then that's where we get those tracking metrics. And we can also look at our detection and response side of that as well for our tracking. So when we're considering this, one of the key areas is that threat intelligence. Make sure you have existing coverage of what your current adversaries are doing. One of the great areas to look for that, by the way, is actually in your email security gateways. That's going to tell you some of those initial actions on objectives that your adversaries that are currently targeting you are doing. So why do we purple team? For one, it's to train our defenders. We can go through and we can have them ready so that they're not marking Mimikatz as a closed case when it gets removed by AV. We also want to test the process between teams. One time I went on an engagement, and with that, we went to the threat hunt team and we're like, hey, do y'all create custom alerts? And they're like, no, the CTI team does that. And we go to the CTI team and we're like, hey, we heard that y'all create the custom alerts here. And they're like, no, SOC must do that. So then we go to the SOC team and we're like, hey, do y'all do custom alerts? And they're like, no, the threat hunt team does that. And then so everyone's around here, it's kind of like that meme where it's like 4 Spider-Man all like pointing at each other. And no one's actually responsible for it. So understanding that teams need to work together and actually discuss this is a huge area. We say test TTPs. When I think about TTPs, I really think about behaviors is what we're testing. We're testing what actions the adversary does on the network. This is because technically TTP is something that we took from like the military because of cyber was coming up. People were like, oh, we need terms. All right, well, let's just use the military terms because that's where cyber kind of started, was the military side of the house. But really what happens is they execute a procedure. That procedure gets mapped to a technique, and then that technique gets mapped to a tactic. So we're really just talking about behaviors. The other area that we also might want to do is replay red team engagements. Oftentimes we have CISOs, they have a nice report from a red team, and the red team got domain admin, they got to the domain controller, they did their thing and they wrecked the environment. Not like, physically wrecked the environment, metaphorically. And with that, oftentimes they want to go through and they actually want to replicate these and start building detections around it. So that's another reason to purple team. But the big thing up here is actually fostering collaboration. That's like the huge side of this, is just having collaboration between teams. Oftentimes, if you are wanting to do a purple team engagement from a manager perspective, get a bunch of people in a room, order a pizza, 2 pizzas, however large your team is, and foster some collaboration. That's really the big driver here of purple team. And one of the big things is, at the end of the day, even though we might have different silos in our organization, it really comes down to this piece up here. All of our teams are really focused on security operations. Whether you're a pen tester, whether you're just doing some sort of compliance-driven type work, if you're actually doing detection and response, all it comes down to is we're trying to keep bad actors out of our organization. So we're all on the same team. When we also talk about purple teaming, one of the areas that we like to focus on is the post access, because access can be expensive. One thing CISOs don't like is just spending money to spend money. They typically want to be efficient with spending their money because we all have limited budgets. So if we're on an engagement or someone asks you to do a purple team test, can you fish your way in? Sure, it might take a day, might take 2 days, might take a week, but we know statistically users will click links. That's a fact. You can put an email that says this is malicious. You can literally send an email that says this is malicious, don't click the link. And statistically, someone will click that link. It's crazy, right? But it happens. So let's just assume breach, and then we want to focus on that installation, setting up that command and control. So right now, if we want to replicate this, we might do some sort of like ISO smuggling. That's really big right now in phishing attacks. So maybe we make a custom ISO and then we replicate the .l and k click. So we don't actually have to phish a user. We can just say, okay, this is what they would do with our current threat landscape. And then typically once they click that L and K file, it's going to do a DLL execution using something like run DLL32. So now we have a lot of the front end detection opportunities that we're covering by doing that emulation. And then after we get that initial command and control set up and installation, it's the actions on objectives. So what do adversaries do once they have hands-on keyboard access with their command and control? But the biggest thing here is we want to catch it before impact. Red Canary report this past year is actually really good. And one of the things they talked about, they said, look, we haven't really seen ransomware incidents. And what they said is we see a lot of precursors to ransomware. And it's because this installation command and control and these actions on objectives, they're catching the actors there. They're catching them there before we have impact to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data. So that's where we see a lot of the business value. It's one of those things where prevention is nice, but we know it hasn't worked. If it worked, ransomware wouldn't be a thing. And also this conference wouldn't be huge because everyone would install AV and then we wouldn't have jobs. So let's focus here and we can prevent that impact if we catch those ransomware type precursors, other precursors of attacks as well. So we see a huge business value there. Once again, prevention's nice, but detection is a must. Some other areas why we assume breach. We've already talked about it, that efficiency and cost. Phishing works, insider threats as well. That might be another reason that you want to do testing. Misconfigurations, or you could already be breached. The other area is 0 day. If an adversary uses a 0 day, you know, they're going to get on to your host. So that's another reason we can assume breach. Also, by the way, I do not recommend testing mobile devices. For one, the telemetry is not good on them. And also, yeah, just talk to legal before you do that because you're going to get into a bunch of weird areas. So if someone asks you to purple team mobile devices, maybe rework them to only testing Linux and your Mac OS, your laptop workstation servers. One reason though, we don't do 0 days replicating 0 day type activity is because of the cost of 0 days. So oftentimes people will be like, hey, can y'all exploit and gain access? We want to replicate that. Like our threat is, you know, APT, X, Y, and Z, and they have a 0 day stockpile. So can you replicate that? And we'll be like, look, they're going to get on your network. Let's just replicate setting up the C2 because then it doesn't matter what 0 day they use. And then also they're like, whoa, we really want you to use a 0 day. Well, up here from Zerodium, a Windows remote code execution 0-click 0 day is going for $1 million. So if someone comes to you and say, hey, use a 0 day to get on the system, you're like, you got $1 million? And then they'll probably say no. When we also talk about purple teaming, once again, we start the first step here with that new cyber threat intelligence. And then that drives us to run the analysis on it. We then map that to attack. By the way, MITRE, if you're doing the MITRE or if you're mapping a MITRE, just a pro tip here. I don't know what that means because a MITRE is a defense contractor that manages FFRDCs. So if you're doing the MITRE, I don't know what that means because that means it's like saying I'm doing the Publix. Like, it's just a company. So attack is a special CTI type product that MITRE developed and put out. But what we do is we map it to attack, then always get in step 3, I call this the permission stage, because before you execute anything on your business network, make sure that you have permission to do it. And then we emulate the attack, and then that's what drives the detection engineering. And that might be the things like elevating existing alerts or deploying new alerts. So, okay, we know that we probably should do this new PurpleTeam thing. We know that we need to evaluate our security operations, but where do we start? So when we're talking about where to start, one of the first areas that we go to is Atomic Red Team. With Atomic Red Team, in this example, there's a nice GUI that they have on the web, and you can see all these different areas over here. So you have like this, by the way, this is for technique 1218.005, so it's sub-technique, and it's executing with MSHTA. By the way, Microsoft has a list of built-in window applications that you should block. It's like, there's like 50 of them. If you just like Google like Microsoft blocked recommendations, it'll come up. And there's like 50 built-in like applications and scripts that they recommend you block. Why do they still put them in there? You know, that's another conversation, I guess, backwards compatibility, but they're like, yeah, we put these things in there and you probably don't really need them, and adversaries commonly use them, but we put them in there for them. It's like, okay, thanks, Microsoft. But anyways, so for this sub-technique that I chose, and if you just go to like atomics up here, you can pick, they have a whole list of different techniques and sub-techniques that you can execute. And then on your right, my left, they have atomic tests for them. So here, if I just click atomic test 1, there'll be like a nice little script that I can grab and I can execute that in my environment. I don't need a red teamer. I don't need a blue teamer to spend a lot of time. Oftentimes people are like, man, it's really hard to do adversary emulation or purple teaming, like because our blue teamers, they don't know how to set up a command and control. They don't know how to use Metasploit. They're not really proficient at Kali. You know, the list goes on and on. But here, as long as you can copy and paste into PowerShell, you can pretty much execute what you need to execute. So we don't have to spend a lot of time training someone to do something new. I mean, I'm pretty sure most people can copy and paste. So this is where we typically recommend starting, is going over these. There we go. Now, instead of copying and pasting, they also have invoke atomics. So this is something that we can set up and install. By the way, whenever we're talking about testing, I recommend testing in multiple ways. Typically what we do, you go and you say, hey, help desk, y'all have a gold image. You grab that gold image, you deploy a VM, it's gonna have your EDR, your AV, all your logging stuff on it, and you can install this on there and you can run these actions. Also, by the way, if you have a different server policy, also do your servers as well. And then typically, we'll also set the test box 1 in prevention mode, or whenever your organization is running by default. Hopefully they're running in prevention mode, but you know, we'll take the default. And then if we need to, we'll also test on a different box where we just have it on alert only mode, because we want to run analysis on the alerts. But with invoke atomic test, as you see here, all we do is we tell it the technique ID that we want to test, and then we tell it which test numbers for that technique ID, and then it automatically just executes those for us. So this drives that telemetry. So now we can go ahead and we can look, do we have logs for this? Do we not have logs for this? We can answer that question confidently now. And then we can also look at alerts. And we can say, do we have alerts for this or do we not have alerts for this? And from there, if we need to fix anything, we can fix it as well. So that's a little bit of starting. And this is just kind of, if you're starting out, this is a basic process. So we test, do we have logs or not? Do we have alerts or not? And then if you want to, you can eventually get to the point where you respond to it. And like we said before, variate. We always want to variate. So what happens when we don't have an alert? I'm here to tell you today, you can be a freaking amazing detection engineer without actually doing detection engineering. I know, it's crazy, right? There's a product called, there's an open source framework called Sigma. And you have over 100 people on Earth that contribute to this. So you have detection engineers that are out there deploying rules to Sigma that you can use. But the problem is you don't know which ones to deploy yet. Well, the same people who made the Sigma project, they also made a EDR that's based on Sigma. I say EDR kind of loosely because it's not like a full-scale EDR in my eyes, but it's pretty good. And the cool thing is if I install this on wherever I'm doing my PurpleTeam actions, it's going to tell me what Sigma rule is available for me to deploy. So if I do an atomic test, which by the way, typically atomic tests, they actually, if you look in their files, they're going to have Sigma rules for them. So if you don't have an alert, you're going to have a recommended logic to create an alert for. But if you're testing new activity and you don't have an alert for it, install Aura, run that activity on that box, and it'll tell you the Sigma rule that you can then deploy. So you can look like an amazing detection engineer by just doing that. Run whatever you need to run on the test box with Aura installed, grab the rule that someone else has engineered, and then slap it into whatever product you need to slap it into. So this is an example of that process. Here, I just ran a who am I command, and then it gives me the output. So it tells me, okay, we have a rule title of who am I. It tells me who the author is. Shout out Florian. He's one of the creators of Sigma. And then it gives me the rule link so I can actually go and look at the rule. By the way, this is actually in Splunk. There's different ways to set up the logging. And then it tells me the match strings. So if I ran multiple steps, I can see what the Sigma actually alerted on because of the match strings. And it gives me a rule description. So here, what I can do is I can copy and paste this URL into my browser. And when I do that, I now have this Sigma rule. So here we can see I need a log source and process creation. The detection is pretty simple. It says image ends with who am I, or the original file name is whoami.exe. So what I do now is I'm looking at this. I can go ahead and write a rule if I need to. Or the other thing that I can do is I can simply copy this. We'll come back to that. I can copy that, put it into this this website called Uncoder.io, and then I can select over here whatever the product is that I need it to go into. And then it translates it for me. So once again, it tells you, if you run the actions, it tells you what the rule is that you need to gain coverage of that, and then you can translate it to your EDR. That's simple. So that's cool because now I can start doing detections on that. I can start validating areas. But the problem that we run into as we start growing, as we start doing purple teaming, as we start validating our detections is, okay, so for process discovery, if we run these atomic tests, what if the adversary is actually doing this? So that's where we have to grow and we actually have to study our adversaries. By the way, whenever there's a procedure, so if I just run task list, it does map to process discovery 1057. But if you look, there's actually a command line execution here. And here we say PowerShell. So most procedures actually have two technique IDs. There's the execution method, and then there's what it's actually trying to do. And that's why if you look at like some reports, especially like the Rectionary one that I've kept referencing, one of the top things that they saw was PowerShell. Why? Because you still need some way to do execution. So that's just something to consider. So what if the adversary is actually doing native API? Well, we need to think about that. We need to test that. And that comes to how do we understand what threats are? Threats have to have hostile intent, capability, and opportunity. If it doesn't have those three things, it's not a threat. We can control opportunity through things like patching and doing stuff like dis-of-stigs, deploying, hardening our workstations, but they're still going to have opportunity. That's just a fact. The capability, as it grows, your threat also grows. And then hostile intent, that's something that typically we can't control, but you kind of can. So like in the case of Sony, maybe if you don't release a movie about targeting the North Korea as a dictator, then maybe North Korea won't actually target you. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this story, they released a movie of them going and killing or trying to assassinate or something the North Korea dictator. And at the end of the day, Sony got breached and they had some embarrassing emails leaked from North Korea. So you kind of can control hostile intent. That's something to consider. But if it's not those three things, it's not a threat. So finding out who are your threats, what you need to do is you need to identify the adversaries of who your threats are, gather the threat intelligence, and then extract those behaviors. What are your threats doing? And then you can test those. So that's how you mature more as you're starting to purple team more. You start growing that way. When we talk about what we want to test, we want to think about our detections. So we have here the Pyramid of Pain by Dave Bianco. He gave a great talk. It's been 10 years now. It's been a decade since he released this, but he gave a great talk at B-Sides Augusta. Highly recommend looking into it. One of the big things he said is, so saying TTPs, he would have probably put behaviors up there, but that's where our focus is. We don't need to replicate hash values, IP addresses, so on and so forth. We have IOC feeds that should be taking care of that automatically. And then we get to areas where it's like network artifacts, and host artifacts and tools. That's where we're focusing on our AV and our next gen firewalls. We're using stuff like Snort and Yara. That's more vendor focused. What we want to focus on is those behaviors. That's the detection validation that we want to run. And when we talk about that, when we talk about behaviors, this comes down to getting up to the procedure level. So if you tell me that an adversary did credential access, I don't know how. If you tell me they dumped LSAS memory, I still don't know how. So if we get to procedure level of what the behaviors are that we need to replicate, that is key. So oftentimes people will go, they'll be like, hey, can you test, credential dumping? And it's like, all right, but which one and why? So these things matter because procedures, they map to techniques. Techniques don't really map down. If someone just says, hey, run these techniques, it's like, all right, well, we can run the atomic test for those techniques, but we are not validating that we would actually detect the adversary in the environment because we don't know what they're doing yet. Why we focus on the procedures is because of the human element. So this comes down to humans have specific training. They fall back on their training. They have certain tools, and those tools have certain capabilities built into them. They also have approved actions. Oftentimes, threat actors are in large organizations, and they only have certain actions that are approved for them to take. We also get to run books and habits. So with habits, if an attacker has been successful doing a procedure the last 5 engagements, do you think they're going to replicate that on the 6th one? Most likely, yes. Until something changes within those operational environments, they're going to keep doing what they've done habitually. And finally, we have run books. So here's an example from the Conti playbook where they're supposed to replace this IP with an actual IP address, but they just copied and pasted into their C2. So they will go through just copy and paste. And it's one of those areas where we have to understand our adversaries at a procedure level because they will reuse procedures. In fact, I believe it was ReliaQuest said that they published recently an event where they actually saw the actor copying and pasting from the Conti playbook still. Even though it's publicly available and out there, like other ransomware operations are still using it because it works, because we're actually bad at validating that we can detect procedures. And with that, why are we bad at, or how bad are we at detecting procedures? So this over here was the APT1 report. This was a decade ago. If you look at these procedures of them enumerating the local group administrators and the domain admins, that was 10 years ago, and it's still working. Here's the Conti playbook. They're still doing those procedures. So I would highly recommend going back to your organization, running those commands, and seeing if it actually trips a response from your SOC or your MSSP. Because if it doesn't, you should have some concerns. So how do we do this testing though based on cyber threat intelligence? This was a report from Microsoft that we just grabbed. And if we were concerned about what this threat actor was doing, or if my CISO or my boss said, hey, did you see this new report from Microsoft? There was a zero-day being exploited, and here's the follow-on activity. It's pretty simple here. We can do some micro tests. So we see MSHTA going outbound. All right, let's test that and see, do we have that activity in our environment? Can we flag on that if the adversary were to use a new ODay and then run that command? We also see who am I being piped out to a text file. All right, let's test that. Does that trigger a response from our SOC or not? So that's how we get down to just trying to do some micro tests when we're starting to see CTI. And that's actually making cyber threat intelligence actionable, not just IOCs coming in, but actually taking something like this and then testing it in our environment. Did that change? Nope. Okay. It like blinked like it did, but it didn't really. So as we evolve from that, we finally will get to a point where we're more mature. And with that, this is an example. By the way, the DFIR report is amazing. You should test pretty much everything on there. Like every organization should be testing that. But this is where we actually get a full-scale attack cycle that we can actually go in and we can test. So this is where what we do here is we'd actually extract each one of these steps. So we see that the user clicked a .lnk file. So we'd build that LNK file, we'd replicate it, and we'd also go through all of these steps. We see ipconfig/all, system info, netconfig workstation. Look, we have the domain trust, netview, all domain, netview, domain admin. See, this is a common one. Highly recommend testing that one. But what we do is then we can actually do full replication. So we can actually get a C2. You can grab one off the internet. By the way, if you don't know which command and control framework to use, there's actually something called the C2 matrix. You can go on there. You can see which ones are free. You can use those for free and build out your own C2 that then you can replicate all these activities with. Otherwise, if you're just starting out, most of these can just be ran within CMD, command prompt, or PowerShell. So that's a great area. So after we've done our testing, this is where we get to an area where we want to document. And this is kind of what documentation looks like. One of the areas that we wanted to focus on at the time, this was a ICE ID, which typically what happens is this would come into an organization and it would execute these commands, and then the initial access broker, they would sell off the access to a ransomware group, and then they would come in and they would drop Cobalt Strike, and then they would go through an organization, they would laterally move, and then they would deploy ransomware later. Well, when we're talking about shifting detection left, we're talking about detecting it early on in that attack chain. So we wanted to get that initial one. By the way, incident response is a lot cheaper if you catch it on the first box. Once something laterally moves, your incident response cost goes way up because the hours go way up, and incident response is not cheap. So what we did though, we tested these 5 common commands that we see ICID do at the initial stages. And we did this against pretty well-known EDR, but we won't say which one. And as you can see, ipconfig/all didn't get an alert, not one alert. But there's a Sigma recommendation. Remember, if we execute something and we run it against Aura, it'll actually tell us our Sigma recommendation. So we could go and we can fix that. Yeah. Right. Flagging an ipconfig is probably not the best thing to do. Some detection recommendations aren't always applicable, but how often, do we see it with /all in our organization? I might go into an organization and with /all, there's no activity for that. So that can be a really quick win and catch an attack early in the cycle. Some organizations /all might be common, it just depends. But maybe then you can tune out a parent process of whatever is actually causing that chain. We went system info, once again, no alert. Who am I/groups? We got one low level alert, but who works lows? No one really. And then we have net config workstation. Once again, no alert, net use, no alert. So we were looking at this data and we said, okay, so when the initial access broker comes in and they run their commands to figure out where they are before they sell off the access, you would not actually get eyeballs on this activity. So that's what I'm coming down to is we need to fix that. We need to be able to actually get eyeballs on a screen that's looking at these alerts. And that's the major thing is we can't evaluate our response unless we actually do the PurpleTeam cycle where we're actually testing some of this activity over here. So we have a few options when it comes down to what we want to do to execute that activity. And the way that works is we have the atomic test. Like we said before, this is easy to automate. Once again, they have that invoke atomic script that we talked about. And we can do some detections around it. Then you get to micro emulations. And this is as you grow from testing atomics, you'll start chaining them together to see how your correlation trips. And then that's usually using about 2 to 3 techniques. And then when you grow to a more mature environment, finally what you get to is testing that full emulation. And that's going to like the default board and running all those steps through because you want to validate. The reason why we do a full emulation is so that if the adversary changes any of those procedures that we've seen, they're probably not going to change all of them, right? So if we've seen 20 procedures that the adversary has done, they might change 10 of them on the next engagement, but they're probably still going to use the same 10 at some point. So what we're trying to do here is we want to put out enough landmines in our environment that the adversary will step on one. That's what we're trying to do, and that's why full emulation is kind of the top, and that's how we go from the walk phase of, or the crawl phase of atomic, the walk phase of micro, and then when we're running, that's where we get to that full emulation side. So with that, I believe that's my last slide. Oh, 2 more things. Resources. This is publicly available. It is a framework. If you want to dive into PurpleTeaming, highly recommend reading this. My buddy George, he actually published this, but he was at Citibank at the time, or briefly after Citibank. Either way, it's meant for very large organizations. With frameworks, adapt frameworks to your organization and the resources that you have, right? So you probably don't have as big of a team as Citi, so adapt it to your organization. Great link, highly recommend checking it out. Version 2 is out. We also do templates. So this is a basic template. We gather a procedure, we then map it to the technique and tactic, and then always cite your CTI source. Because oftentimes people will be like, an adversary wouldn't run who am I? And then you can say, yes, they do, and we have the link that you can click and we can show you. So that's something to consider as well. All right, so happy hunting, and now I open it up for questions.